The Sabbath has been called the first labor law. God graciously realizes that we need rest, just as God rested on the seventh day. But you know, we humans in our fallen state have a way of screwing things up. You know, we do that with all kinds of good things that God gives us. God gives us good food, and we take it too far and become gluttons. Good drink, and we become drunks. You know, rest, and sometimes we become lazy. God created our world good, but in our sinfulness, we do sometimes mess up. This can be even true when we try to be good or godly, and we end up realizing things don't go the way we had hoped. I'm sure we've all experienced that. You wanted to do something good and it turned out as a disaster. Thankfully, though, our misguided efforts are covered by God's grace. And this grace exists as this kind of blanket over us, and there's no way that the redeemed can get out from under that blanket, that we're still covered in that grace. Our assurance is in God's hands. It's not in our own, and that's the good news. Now today we're looking at a passage that comes from the second chapter of Mark's Gospel. Early in his Gospel, Mark sharpens the distinction and the conflict that exists between Jesus and other religious groups there in the first century, especially the Pharisees. Jesus is doing a new thing, as we learn in the opening of this reading with the parable that we have here, the parable of the wineskins. Then we see this example of a new thing with a reinterpretation about what the Sabbath is really all about. So listen now for God's word, or follow along with your own Bibles or with your own readings as I read from second chapter beginning with the 21st verse. Jesus is speaking here. No one sews a piece of unstruck cloth on an old cloak. Otherwise the patch pulls away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, otherwise the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost. And so are the skins. But one puts new wine into fresh wineskins. One Sabbath he was going through the grain fields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" He said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need of food? He entered the house of God when Abiathar was high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priest to eat. And he gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath." This is the word of the Lord. Let me start with a question. Do you think the Pharisees were picking on Jesus for the wrong reason? And let me explain that a little bit. I mean, they get all over him for harvesting grain on the Sabbath, but they do not say anything about Jesus and the disciples being out there in someone else's grain field. Nor do they get on him for traveling on the Sabbath. I mean, after all, in the first century, the rabbis had interpreted the meaning of the Sabbath to be that you could not travel more than 2,000 steps. Roughly 8 football fields. Think about this for a moment as I'm going to go off on a tangent. I've told before about I've inherited my Presbyterianism from my great granddaddy Mackenzie, who was a strong church leader. He was an elder at Culldy Presbyterian Church for over 40 years. It was a church that his father and grandfather had actually helped establish right after the Civil War. Like most churches in the day, it emphasized the fear of God, and the preacher regularly reminded the congregation of the coming judgment. Now, my great-granddaddy often told stories about his life when he was a boy. And I really wish I had written those down, but I was just a boy at the time, so I didn't think anything about it. And I can only remember a few of the stories, but there are a few I do remember, including this particular one. It happened one summer day when he was out kind of goofing off that day, and he found himself in a neighbor's watermelon patch. And it was hot, and the watermelons were getting ripe. And so he went around and started thumping them, found one that sounded really nice, good, and ripe, and he took out his knife and he cut down into the middle of that watermelon, and he dug down with his hand and he grabbed a good chunk of the heart of that watermelon out, and he began to eat it, and it was so good. I mean, there's about 2 redeeming things about hot summer days, and it tends to be tomatoes and watermelons in my book. Well, that was so good, he decided to try another one and another. And soon, I mean, he had watermelon juice running down his chin. His front of his shirt was all wet with watermelon juice. And he was continuing to stuff himself when something strange occurred. He noticed it was beginning to get a little cooler. It was getting a little darker, but this was in the middle of the day, and there were no clouds in the sky. And the birds began to sing as if it was evening. And then my young great-granddaddy looked up, and to his horror, he could see that the sun was gradually disappearing. You know what's happening. But he did. And he dropped that watermelon he was working on the ground, and he ran back to his house as fast as he could in his bare feet. Because as he told me, he says, I did not want to be caught in another man's watermelon patch on Judgment Day. At the time, he didn't know what was happening, which was perhaps good, because I think it instilled in my great-granddaddy a healthy awe of the Creator. Now, this brings me back to the subject of Jesus and the disciples. Out munching in somebody else's field on the Sabbath. And the reason the Pharisees didn't get on to Jesus and his disciples harvesting food that didn't belong to them was that there was a Jewish law that allowed you to do that. According to Deuteronomy, we're told, if you go into your neighbor's field, neighbor standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put the sickle to the standing grain. Put this in modern terms. You could take what you need to quench your thirst, but you couldn't go drive a combine through the field. I'm not sure if this applies to watermelons. The loophole in the law, though, was something that was necessary back in these days, long before you had road stop fast food places. Because if people were traveling, they had to have a way to get something to eat. So they would go into a neighboring field to the road, and they would find something that they could eat. But they could only take what they needed. They couldn't go through, like I said, and cut everything down. So the Pharisees do not get on to Jesus' disciples for theft. They also don't get onto them for traveling on the Sabbath. And this is probably true because for them to have seen what the disciples were doing out in that grain field, they too would have been guilty of having traveled too far on the Sabbath. Points out to part of our human sinfulness is that we tend to overlook those sinful acts with which we ourselves struggle in. You know, it's much easier to get on somebody else about something that they're doing that doesn't affect us, that doesn't bother us. But if we struggle with it, we sometimes let those kinds of things slide. So instead of getting on them for stealing grain or for going too far on the Sabbath, they accused Jesus and his disciples for laboring on the Sabbath. The labor that involves harvesting, that is plucking the grain, and threshing, which is rubbing the grain in your hands to kind of break off the chaff so you can eat the kernels. It's kind of picky, don't you think, what they're doing here? And Jesus defends himself by recalling that David once ate not just grain out in a field, but the holy bread that was there in the tabernacle when he was hungry. Now, what's going on here? Jesus does something new here. Our passage begins with this illustration about putting a patch on a piece of clothing or a jacket or coat that we have. You know, probably a few of us experience that. Normally when something wears out, we just throw it away. But back then, you didn't do that. Cloth was expensive. But you better have some pre-shrunk cloth to sew on there. Otherwise, you're going to have a problem later on. Also, he talked about the fermentation of wine. Now today we age our wine basically in factories and barrels, but back in the first century, you know, they were done in animal skins. These skins, and you had to have a fresh new one for the first part of that fermentation. Otherwise, the fermentation would be so great it would just bust the skins and you would lose all the wine at that time. So you made sure the cloth you used to patch something was pre-shrunk and that your wine skins were new so that they would stretch and would not burst during the fermentation process. And then you have, after that parable, you have this illustration of Jesus and disciples in the field on the Sabbath, which is an example, I think, of what he's talking about here, of something new, a new interpretation for the Sabbath. And it doesn't go over well with the establishment because people don't like change. I mean, that was true in the first century just as it is true today. But in Jesus Christ, God does something new. Something that upsets the apple cart, so to speak, because God is reaching out to reach all of us, to reach a fallen humanity. God's reaching out for us. Now, the Sabbath law demonstrates God's concern for our well-being. To paraphrase Jesus' remarks to the Pharisee, the Sabbath was made for us, not the other way around. We weren't made for the Sabbath. The Jewish faith at the time of Jesus, though, so emphasized the Sabbath that it was seen as a mark of faith. However, Jesus challenges this idea and reminds that the Sabbath is theirs, not the other way around. But the legalists, they just don't want to have anything to do with that. They like this idea that they are distinct because they keep this one day of week so sacred. As the Sabbath is made for us, we should consider how it was understood in the early church. Paul tells the Romans that some think one day is better than another day, while others think all days are equal. And in Colossians, Paul says that we shouldn't let ourselves be judged over the Sabbath. From the writings of Paul, the early church felt they had the right to shift the Sabbath from the last day of the week, the traditional Jewish Sabbath, to the first day of the week, the day that we celebrate as a Christian Sabbath, to honor Jesus' resurrection. That says Paul does not suggest that we forget the Sabbath, because we still need rest. Only it's not rigidly required that our rest occur on a particular day of the week. On the one hand, this is good. God grants us freedom. Unfortunately, this freedom has led many just to forget about the Sabbath altogether. That was not the intention either. Jesus is concerned, though, for our well-being. Legalism upsets him. One must eat, but the religious leaders of this day wants to make that difficult. Jesus teaches us here something about the gracious nature of God. There is a dangerous tendency to see law and to see things like the Ten Commandments as restrictions on our freedom. But that's not why they were given. God did not give the commandments as a test that we have to pass in order for us to make it into paradise. Instead, the commandments are rough guidelines. We can think about them as kind of the boundary. And if we stay within this broad boundary that's set up in the commandments, we can then have life and have it to the fullness. And we can give thanks. The Sabbath is the day to catch our breath. We give thanks. And when I was a small child, we lived about probably 2/10 of a mile or so, but it was on the adjacent parcel to my great-grandparents' farm. And on occasion, we would eat lunch with them on Sunday after church. And the first thing when my great-grandma, when she got home from church, she would get a bunch of lighter wood up, and she would light a fire in the wood stove and begin to make biscuits. You know, much of the dinner had already been prepared the day before or early that morning, but those biscuits had to be fresh. So she would start the fire. Don't get the idea, though, that we were hillbillies. My great-grandma had a perfectly good new gas range that sat right next to her wood-burning stove. She just preferred to bake in the wood-burning one. After her death in the summer of '64, that wood-burning range disappeared. I wondered whatever happened to it. But before then, I have good memories as a kid of probably 5 or 6 of being out in the yard with my great-granddaddy, and he'd be splitting up firewood, stove wood. And as he would split it, I would gather it all up and pile it together to haul in for the firebox. And as the oven was heating up, she would then mix up some flour and salt and baking soda and cut in some lard and then add the buttermilk and knead this gooey mess until it was nice and smooth, and then roll it out and stamp out the biscuits. And soon a heavenly scent would fill that room. Now when the meal was over, if the meal was without pie, and normally on Sundays we had pie, but if we didn't have pie, if it was another day of the week, when the meal was over, my great-granddaddy would get up and he would go over to the pantry and he'd come back with either a jar of honey or solder. And he'd come back and he would take a pat of butter and put it in the middle of his plate and pour one of the other sweeteners on there and mix it all up with the fork, and then he'd just kind of throw all kinds of his manners kind of out the window as he began to take the leftover biscuits and sop them up. Sop that afterwards, we kids would go run out and we'd play. They had a bunch of huge magnolia trees around their house that we would climb up in and play for some time in the afternoon. The adults, they would either retire out to the back porch if it was summer, if it was winter, they would go into the parlor by the heater. And when we'd come back in an hour or so later to see what's going on, they would all be napping. Now, that's the Sabbath. Jesus in this story doesn't negate the Sabbath. He just encourages us to use the Sabbath as it was created, which is for our benefit. So take a deep breath. Receive the Sabbath as a gift from a gracious God.